Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer from the Department of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I serve as the host of our program. With me today are our two regular commentators. On my right is Regena Nelson, who is in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Educational Studies in the College of Education and Human Development at Western Michigan University. And on my left is Don Cooney. Don is in the School of Social Work at Western Michigan University and also serves as a city commissioner here in the city of Kalamazoo. We picked this topic a while back to talk about, which is gun violence. And in the meantime, we decided to have the police chief come in. We had the availability of being the chief of public safety and to talk about what the city of Kalamazoo is doing. So this time we want to come back and revisit the issue of gun violence. And I guess just to get us started, I think it's important to make a distinction, because when we talk about gun violence, it's not just all of the same. There's several separate interrelated problems here. One of the issues I think that people are most concerned with, of course, are mass shootings, right? Right before the public safety chief came, we had the shooting up at Michigan State University, so that was fresh on our minds as we talked the last time. And of course, those have become so almost routine in American society. It's really a scary phenomenon that we have so many of these mass shootings. In fact, I think we've had almost as many mass shootings this year as we have days in the year so far. More. It's just amazing and disheartening. So that's one phenomena that we can look at. And of course, access to guns, particularly very lethal weapons, is a major concern there. But there's also another very important form of violence, which unfortunately has become sort of routine. And that is a level of interpersonal violence in many American cities, in particular neighborhoods, which has a very heavy toll and somehow kind of flies under the radar because it happens sort of routinely, one at a time. And I think, even if the newspapers report on it, it kind of, another shooting happened on the south side of Chicago, right? And people tend to, I think, sort of tune out on that. But this is also a really important phenomena for us to focus on, which takes a tremendous toll on our cities, on our neighborhoods, and but yet I think they're sort of separate kinds of issues, but they're related both by the issue of guns. So I thought we could try to talk a little bit about both of those issues today. You're from Chicago.
Yes.
The South Side, and of course Chicago is often pinpointed as one of the places where this kind of more routine interpersonal violence takes place. By the way, it's not it's not number one in terms of the level of violence. There are other cities that are far more violent than Chicago. So Chicago sort of unfairly gets picked on, I think. But nonetheless, there are some very severe problems with gun violence. The south side of Chicago, the west side of Chicago in particular. What's your take on how the people of Chicago interpret this or react to it, and what they think about what could be done about it in terms of, there's a mayoral election going on in Chicago right now?
Exactly, that's what I was going to say.
I'm sure
that this is
that's the issue, right?
Exactly, this is the issue that's will drive people to vote. Are we cracking down on crime, violent crimes? How can we make the city safe again? Because you have so many innocent bystanders who, their children sometimes just crossing the street and they get caught in the crossfire of this. And those stories make the headlines of it's just chaotic. It can happen to anybody. And so people are very nervous and very scared about living in environments like that. And you just feel like, even if I'm not a target, even if I'm not doing anything that I shouldn't be doing, it can still happen to me. So what do we need to do to protect everybody? And who has the answer to this? And what are the causes of this? And we do know there are underlying causes that we'll talk about around economics and poverty and the trauma, that people are really doing this out of survival skills. So when we have situations like that, how do we bring the temperature down so that people can feel safe and not use violence as a means to deal with these situations, these high pressure situations?
Yeah. We find in the city that most of the violence is coming from young people. And so the strategy that Chief Boyson is trying to identify who are these young people and trying to head off their involvement in violence. I'll just give you one example. They do a lot of research, and they identified 8 young people, I think from 12 to 17, who among them had 324 encounters with the police. Wow. 8 of them. So they set up a special program for them with the Boys and Girls Club. And I think it went for a year. And before that, that group had 127 arrests. 6 months after that, we had 7 arrests among those guys. Because we concentrated on them and that's a very expensive kind of thing to figure 8 kids. But look at the payoff. But it showed so clearly that when you target people that are on the edge and give them those supports, there's a way out and they don't end up in the violence.
Yeah, I think one of the important things for people to understand about this kind of routine interpersonal violence is that it's very concentrated.
Yes.
It's a very specific geographic concentration. I use a book by the criminologist Elliot Curry in my course on criminal justice. He looks at violence in kind of a comparative world perspective. And he makes the same point around the world. He said, violence is concentrated in specific geographic areas and not in others. And that's important because that tells us something, right? If the violence is so concentrated in particular social locations, then there's something about those social locations that's driving the violence. It's not widespread across all societies. It's not all parts of the society. It's located in very specific geographic sectors. And when we look at those geographic areas, what do we find? We generally find high levels of poverty, high levels of joblessness. We find marginal work available for people there, the lack of meaningful things to do, the lack of health care, educational opportunities are limited. We find a whole variety of things that sociologists would refer to as structural factors, structural roots. And those things, as Curry demonstrates in his book, these are the things that lead to violence, right? This is what causes the violence. It's not that violence afflicts us in a widespread way. It's very concentrated, and it's concentrated in these particular areas where we have these specific social deficits, these social problems. And so if we want to deal with them, I mean, law enforcement has to deal with it in some way, right? I mean, if you've got people shooting up the place and people acting out in violent ways, then, public safety, police departments have to respond. But police departments are, for the most part, reactive, okay? The violence occurs, then they get called and they respond. Now, again, our public safety and many are becoming more proactive.
Absolutely.
Right. They're not waiting until the violence occurs. They're going out to try to address some of these factors. But police departments are limited in what they can do. We can see some good programs and some good progress, but they're limited in what they can do to address these underlying structural causes. So that means that the rest of the society has to get involved, right? City government, what you guys are trying to do, state government has to step in, and of course the federal government, because what is necessary is the provision of public support and public investment to deal with the variety of structural causes that lead to the violence. And unfortunately, in our society, we're often not willing to make those public investments, right? We allow the problem to exist over there and fester, and we could intervene and we could act in ways that are going to reduce that violence, but often we choose not to do so. And when we make other kinds of investments with our public money, such as a defense bill, Defense Department that takes up over $850 billion, and defense spending as a total that takes up $1.5 trillion every year, right? So it's a matter of priorities. It's a matter of making conscious decisions about what kinds of things we're going to support, what kind of investments we're going to make. And unfortunately, we choose not to make the investments that would be best able to address this kind of violence that takes place in our streets.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and specifically in the city, the chief is really working on prevention. We focus on prevention. What you said, it's not the city or the police department that is going to be the center of that. It's other organizations in the city, such as, for example, KidNet, which is a coalition of, I don't know, 30 different youth organizations who focus on out-of-school time and set up different programs with them. So in the city, we're saying, okay, we want to put out programs to try to do this. What we just did this week was give them $1 million, and they in turn are going to take that $1 million and they're going to put $800,000 on the table for organizations in the neighborhoods to apply for that. Mm-hmm. And then they're going to provide the services for the young people because they're the closest to them. So it's really clear that from an elected official's point of view, we're not going to solve this problem. We're going to try to get the resources to the people that can solve the problem, and we have a lot of those here. It seems to me that in a place like Kalamazoo, where we have such resources, we should be able to target and put those supports out there for those folks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree, and I think sometimes the issue is where we put our priorities and not putting it in preventative, because that's a long-term solution. You may not see it in 2 years, 4 years, the result. When someone has to be campaigning for re-election, it has to show that they've made results. So we're up against that clock all the time. And so you think about like early childhood education, the research has shown that students who have high quality early childhood education, they start school ready, they're more engaged in school, and as a result, if they're more engaged in school, they're not veering off into some of these areas where they can get into trouble, which then leads to criminal behavior, like the research shows that. So putting that money up front, you know, we keep saying this, is you're gonna pay here or you're gonna pay there. Yep. So you might as well invest it here for a positive outcome rather than later in the criminal justice system rehabilitating people. And so we have to just have a mindset shift in our culture to understand that and to support that, like you said, community-wide, society-wide.
Right, right. The universal child care would be an enormously important step forward, and there is a movement now to move toward that in the city, but it's a long way to go because it's expensive. Exactly. It costs a lot of money.
So I used to sort of somewhat tongue-in-cheek always talk about the Fram oil filter model. I don't know if anybody remembers, there was a commercial for Fram oil filters, and it showed this greasy mechanic, right? And he's holding up and he says, "You can pay me now, or you can pay me later," right? You can pay me now to install this oil filter in your car, and it'll take care of the problem. Or you can wait until it breaks down, and then I have to rebuild your engine, and then it's going to cost you, you know, $1,000 more, right? So what do you want? Pay me now or pay me later, right? And you know, it's maybe a humorous way to try to drive across to people that, yeah, we're going to pay one way or the other, right? There's going to be a public cost here, and what should we do? How should we make a wise choice here? Should we invest now in early education and these other kinds of programs and try to head off or prevent some of the violence that's going to occur later on? or should we wait till the violence occurs? Now we've got victims, we've got cost to deal with, plus now we have to kind of clean up the mess, bring the police and the criminal justice system in, right?
Yeah.
Arrest people, prosecute people, maybe incarcerate people at enormous cost.
Right.
And so, again, if we wait, if we don't make the upfront investments at a reasonable cost, then we're going to pay big time later on to try to clean up the mess after the engine breaks down. So I think if we could just convince people of the Fram oil filter argument, that we might be in better shape here.
Yes.
And the larger point here, again, is that in dealing with an issue like criminal violence, it's important to think about it in terms of a public health perspective rather than just as a crime problem.
Yes.
If we think about it as a crime problem, then we think, oh, we got to arrest people, we got to prosecute people, we got to punish people, this is the way out. No, in fact, all the evidence from criminologists is that this is the least effective way to deal with these problems. And in fact, a public health model is much better. And in the public health model, I think it's important to point out that they talk about 3 levels of prevention. There's primary prevention, where you're looking at the larger environment, right? You're looking at those broader structural factors that can be, dealt with to try to reduce or prevent violence from occurring. There's a secondary level, where now you're looking at very specific at-risk groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those kids in poverty who need to have a Head Start program, need to have an investment in early education, right? So that when they get to school, they're going to be prepared. And we know that those secondary level programs, which are targeted at specific at-risk groups, then with some kind of intervention can be very, very effective. And then the third level is sort of a tertiary level. Third level is, okay, with some people, we can't prevent the disease from hitting the community. We can't protect all the at-risk populations. Some people are still going to get sick. Some people are still going to succumb to the violence. Then we've got to intervene and provide some kind of therapy, rehabilitative care, right? Not just punishment, but often we need now some kind of therapeutic approach to take. So that public health model, I think, is really important. If people could think about the violence problem with that perspective, I think it would help a lot. I think you'd get more support for some of the policies that are necessary to deal with violence in our society. So.
Yeah, the chief always says, we will help you if you let us. We will stop you if you make us. But the first step is, okay, we know that you guys are on the edge here, and we would like to provide some supports for you. If you guys will allow us to do that, we'll do that. But if you're going to pick up a gun or you're going to get out there and hurt other people, then we're going to stop you. We have to stop you. But that's not our choice. Our choice is to head this off. And that's kind of the philosophy that he's been working on over there. Yeah. And one of the things that he has a monthly meeting with social service providers. The room is full of people from different social service agencies in the city to talk about what do you guys see out there? How can we work together closer so that they head off?
Exactly.
Eases his jobs. Yeah. But you know, a new book by Matthew Desmond called Poverty in America. And I have not read this book yet, but I've heard him interviewed 4 times. And I've read other stuff by Michael Desmond. And what he talks about is what you mentioned before, Ron, the priorities of the nation. I mean, we could do these things if we had the resources to do them. There is a will, there is the ability to do universal childhood in this community. But the resources are the problem. We don't have it. And why don't we have those resources? Desmond says it's the way this society is structured. And he talks about, just take one thing. He says if we had the amount of money that the wealthiest people owe in taxes but aren't paying, which he estimates at $177 billion, we would be able to have, just on that one thing, to alleviate the poverty that we have in the country. So what I guess I'm trying to say is, it's local can do what they can, but without the resources from the national government, it's very, very difficult.
Poverty is a conscious choice that a society makes. This is the point Desmond makes, that there are certain decisions that we make as a society, as government, that lead to an exacerbation of the poverty that exists in our society. And that, of course, is, as Curry demonstrates so well, is linked to the violence. The reason that we have high levels of violence in certain geographic areas is because of the underlying social conditions in those areas, right? There's a high level of poverty, there's social exclusion, there's marginalized work, there's a lack of social supports and public services, there are strained families, there are lack of resources for schools to deal with kids from strained families who are coming to school with all kinds of problems, and we allow that to continue. It's a conscious choice to allocate public money over here, but not for there. And we can't then be surprised, as we sometimes, oh, well, why is there so much violence in our society? Well, again, it's because the structural conditions are ripe for producing that violence, and we refuse to make the public investments to deal with those underlying social problems. And I mean, this goes back also to the ideology of neoliberalism, right?
Yeah.
I mean, people might think that's a sort of a jargony term. Neoliberalism is basically a ideological and philosophical position that's long-standing. It's gone by other names and other times. But essentially, the point is that government should not become involved in dealing with social problems. Government should stand back. Government should allow the capitalist market, the private market, to operate, and that somehow the market is magical. It always produces the right outcomes, and government only screws things up when it tries to act. And so the neoliberal approach is to back off, not have any regulation of corporate enterprise or business enterprises, not to make investments in public services and social supports, and that's the best policy for government, to stand back and be inactive and not involved, and that's going to produce good results. Well, that's just, I mean, it's completely false, right? I mean, there's an abundant amount of evidence that this is a recipe for disaster, right? That this doesn't produce good results. There is no magic to the marketplace. What the marketplace will produce is high levels of economic inequality, extreme concentration of wealth, and it will allow these kinds of social problems to fester. And the government has been sidelined by a particular ideology that says, no, you can't do that. And as long as that particular ideology takes hold and becomes ascendant in a society, as it did in the United States and much of the world in the 1980s. This is Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and this is where a lot of the neoliberalism comes from. Remember Reagan famously saying, you know, the government's not the solution, the government's the problem, right?
That's right.
Well, if the government's the problem, then get the government out of there, right?
Right.
And that was enormously attractive to a lot of people, and so they bought into that, and as a result of that, we get this neglect, this lack of public investment, this inability to deal in any kind of way with the underlying structural roots and social problems, and we end up with these kind of high levels of violence and extreme levels of poverty.
Yes. And I think one of the things is to contradict that argument is just what happened with the pandemic when we did put money into the cities. I mean, just the child family allowance. Right.
Decreased the poverty levels, and it had a
almost
big impact.
In half, almost in half, just that one thing. In 6 months, reduced the poverty level among families and children by almost half. So we know how to do it. That's the agonizing part. We know the supports that are needed, yeah. And you deal in the schools all the time.
Yeah, and you know, what we're seeing, you know, post pandemic, or the trauma from the pandemic now, that this stressful situation carries over into the schools. And so, you know, as we look at test scores and students' emotional health and mental health, we're very concerned, because this is an age where they're very vulnerable to taking drastic solutions to problems that they perceive like they can't see beyond that. And so we don't have enough support in the schools to provide what they need to help them with this, so that we can watch and see who needs that extra support. People are going to slip through the cracks, and it just takes one student who is in this desperate situation to have a violent act that impacts everybody. So this is a real concern. If we don't act now, we're just going to see more and more of these situations that we're seeing with the mass shootings. Yeah.
So we're kind of going through a transition here in the city with a new superintendent
Yes.
on the horizon, and I've been impressed with the meetings. I only was at one of them, but they've been having a lot of meetings with the community to talk about what are we going to be looking for here and what do we want. I know I was at a meeting and I was really impressed with the turnout, but especially people that were involved in social services, in the Upjohn Research Institute, government, and the place was packed, and seriously, it showed that the community really cares and understands the importance of how we move forward in the schools.
Exactly. They've been very vocal about, you know, lifting up student voice, families' voices about what's working and what's not working, and that we need to listen and address these issues that we're seeing if we want all students to be successful. Yeah.
So we're going to see how that
Right. If we pick the right leader who's able to do that.
Yeah, so that'll be interesting.
There's a larger issue that I feel needs to be brought into the discussion here too, and that is the destructive impact of the history of racial oppression in the United States, right? I mean, when we talk about these concentrated geographic areas, very often they're black neighborhoods that are being afflicted. The violence is just incredible. In Chicago, I think the African American population is about 31% of the population in Chicago, yet 80% of the homicide victims are black. Just as one statistic to illustrate this. And again, we're going back to all those underlying social problems that I talked about earlier. All of those were either created or aggravated by racial segregation and by conscious decisions that were made on the basis of racial segregation at a particular point in American history, right? And yet, that's, to me, what's so offensive about the Ron DeSantis and the others who want to say, you know, you can't bring up critical race theory. You can't talk about this issue. Why not? This is the most important issue to talk about. This is the central feature of American history.
Yeah.
Right.
Everything that we're trying to deal with often goes back to this kind of legalized to slavery and legalized segregation. And now to pretend that somehow all of that doesn't matter anymore, and if you bring up that history, this history which is so critically important, if you bring up that history, that somehow that's out of bounds, that that's offensive. What do you mean? It's offensive that you want to wipe away that history, that you want to eliminate that larger historical social context, because we can't understand the problems that we're dealing with unless we take that history into account.
Absolutely.
And I just find it so offensive that Republican Party leaders like Ron DeSantis and others are attempting to say, this is out of bounds, you can't talk about this. I mean, it's like pretending, like, you know,
it didn't matter.
That it didn't matter, that somehow it's all gone away, or it didn't matter in the first place. And that's just so wrong. It's so wrong, and it hinders us, right? It really hinders us from making the conscious political decisions about how to deal with this problem. And I think that just needs to be, and Elliot Curry pulls this out and illustrates this so well in his book, which is about a peculiar situation, right? Du Bois's term, and basically to say that to ignore the impact of the history of racial oppression and how it has set up many of the current problems that we face and continue to face is just you know, to miss the larger point here about how to deal with this problem.
Yeah, right, right. Yes, we really have to come to grips with that and not just talk about it, but the implications are with resources and putting resources into communities where the struggle is evident and why is evident. You always say social supports reduce crime. The lack of social supports increase crime. So we know that. And, but social supports cost money, and we had to put that money into it. We haven't done it. There's another piece to this when you look at the violence that you mentioned, Ron, before, and that is suicide. I mean, the percentage of people that are dying, is that increasing? Or is that, I mean, it's among people that die from gun violence, what percentage are suicides?
I think I put that in the notes that I sent out earlier.
I think it was at least half.
Yeah, it's yeah, roughly 55 to 60% of annual gun deaths in the United States are suicides.
So,
not homicides or accidental
Right,
deaths.
right.
So it's a very high proportion if you think about it. And I think if people think about gun violence, they think about shootouts on the street, right? Leading to a high number of deaths. But actually it's, and I do think, and again, I would need to go back and check the research on this, but I do think that that level of suicide has been increasing
I think so.
over time.
Yeah.
And in fact, the level of suicide has been increasing among white working class populations.
Exactly.
Right?
Because of the frustration that they feel, like opioid crisis, which comes from people feeling that they lost their jobs, they don't have the skills for new kinds of jobs, and that they're useless now, and they end up with these problems.
Yeah, I think some economists have been referring to these deaths as deaths of despair.
Right.
And again, if you have white working class populations that are also experiencing economic difficulties, you know, marginal jobs and strained families and many of the problems that are also afflicting other neighborhoods, then those same kinds of problems have to be dealt with in some way.
Exactly.
And what's really unfortunate, I think, one sociologist has referred to this as death by whiteness, and that is that they often refuse to accept social supports and public services because they might benefit African Americans. So there's this sort of, again, this legacy of racism in our country is so strong that people don't want government to take any action because if government takes action, it might help those other people, right? And so they refuse to have government become involved in a way which might benefit them because of this legacy of racism, this institutionalized racism in our society. And so, yeah, there's a considerable amount of research by sociologists about this phenomena, death by despair, and again, the unwillingness, the ideological and political unwillingness of certain whites to accept government support because they somehow think it's inappropriate for government to act to help other people that they think are undeserving of that kind of support and help.
Keep government out of my Social Security and Medicare.
Yeah.
That's what they say.
Yeah. I think the other relationship too with the increase in suicide is with the gun safety laws in the states where they haven't passed those laws. You do see this increase in suicide, and people don't understand that this issue impacts you as well, not just about your rights, but to help people who are in these situations of despair that they have other options, not to use a gun on themselves, because we have some laws to help, some safeguards there to not go there.
Right.
Yeah.
The availability of guns is such a contributing factor to all these things we're talking about. Right.
Exactly.
It's an independent force that intensifies and lethalizes the underlying problems that we've been talking about. So if you have conflicts and disputes in a neighborhood and kids are engaged in a fist fight and you end up with a bloody nose, right? And a hurt feeling maybe. At the least a broken arm, right? But when you make available guns, when guns are flooding into those neighborhoods, then this turns lethal, right?
Right. Right.
And so again, that fight on the playground turns into a homicide. And that's one of the things that's really different now, the glut of guns in our society and the amount of guns that have been, for about 30 years now, flowing into these central city areas has really significantly contributed to the problem.
So we're atypical, right, as a country, of the availability of guns? I mean,
for the most part, yes. And again, there's also a kind of a larger culture about gun usage in our society and support for guns that contributes to that. There are other societies that have a lot of guns but don't have a culture or a fetish about guns and again, they don't have the extreme amount of poverty and marginality that we have in our society. So it's that lethal combination, right? Those underlying structural roots combined with the guns and the gun culture that then leads to an explosion of gun violence.
Yeah. So I'm wondering now, the Democrats have control of the state legislature and the governorships, and they're talking about this. So I'm wondering, what are the discussions? What are they saying that they would like to do as far as limiting the availability of guns? Do we know? I mean, I hear red flag laws. I hear, you mentioned in the piece you sent us about, I don't know if they're talking about 21 years old being required. I'm not sure if they're talking about that one. But also the mandatory locks on guns, and outlawing these terrible weapons that were only created for battle. So, I mean, there's a lot of things they could do, right? A lot of things that we could do to limit that availability of guns, right?
Exactly. Yeah. We're already starting to see some interesting pushback on that to get people riled up with misinformation about what this means, right? And so there was a major story where they were linking this push for gun safety laws to Holocaust.
The chair of the Republican Party in Michigan made this very explicit. Yes, she did.
Exactly. So once again, some apologies have been made, but the leadership is saying we're not going to back down on that. We see this as taking away our rights again, and we will not stand for that. And this is what it leads to in the extreme.
And this is with regard to just relatively minor things that are being done, right? Gun storage laws.
Right.
I mean, it's not like a law has been passed to come out and confiscate all the guns of the citizens of Michigan, right? Which is what she sort of was implying, that even these minor little things that are being done, and they're important things, but red flag laws and storage laws, those are minor steps in dealing with the overall problem of the availability of guns in our society. And yet she goes to this outrageous assertion that somehow this is confiscating guns and that this is what led to the Holocaust. And, you know, I mean, not only is that offensive and trivializes the Holocaust, but it's just completely out of proportion to the issue that's being discussed.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the thing, that these are so distorted. Any kind of an effort to try to control this problem is distorted to make it look like, well, this is going to make things worse, when we know it's going to make things better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And particularly when the majority of people, if you do look at the polls, support gun safety laws.
Right.
So it's the politicians who are steering it this way. Yeah. So
And there's sort of this, there's another falsehood that's very prominent in the discussion here, and that is that somehow more guns leads to less
safety.
violence, right?
Yeah, right.
You know, more guns, less crime. Well, again, this is completely false. There's a criminologist by the name of John Lott who's been pushing this idea for years. And his research and his data has been thoroughly trashed and demonstrated to be almost completely false. That none of what Lott says about this has any kind of empirical support. But yet, he's on all the talk shows and he's out there promoting this idea that somehow more guns produces less crime. The reality is that the research shows the exact opposite. Right. The more guns, the more violence that you have. The more you interject guns into a situation, the more likely you are to have homicides, suicides, accidental shootings.
Right.
And in fact, so it's a completely false and distorted idea that somehow if there's more guns, that an armed society is a polite society. No, an armed society is a deadly society where people are going to get shot and killed.
Right.
And yet somehow that just doesn't seem to get through. There are still so many people who are enmeshed in the gun culture who think that guns are the answer, right? That you have to, you know, one of the responses if there's crime in the society, then I got to arm myself. I've got to be prepared. I've got to be able to protect myself, my family. But again, all the evidence shows that if you acquire a gun and keep a gun in your house for protection, you only make your family more vulnerable.
Exactly.
You only increase the risk that that gun is going to be used in a suicide or an accidental shooting or a homicide. Mm-hmm. And so, but it's so hard to break through this. There's just such a strong culture of support for guns in American society. You know, you just can't convince some people that their guns are actually a threat to them, and that keep possessing those guns or possessing many of those guns is somehow making them safer. It's not making them safer. They might think that, but it's not true. But again, the empirical evidence seems not to matter when you're talking about an important cultural commitment that's part of somebody's identity, their social identity and their group identity. To try to convince them otherwise with empirical evidence just utterly fails.
Right, right, yeah. So I don't know. One specific kind of thing is these machine gun kinds of things that we at one point did outlaw, and then it was sunsetted. But you would think that the evidence is so clear on that we could stop that one, but that's not been successful either.
And the AR-15s and other assault-type weapons like that, which are basically, as you said, weapons of war, those are often the weapons of choice for the mass shooters, right?
Right.
This is the situation now where we can transition over and talk about the mass shootings. And again, those kind of weapons make it much more likely that somebody who's intent on committing a mass shooting is going to be able to kill an awful lot of people in a quick period of time. And so, and again, what justification is there for having these kinds of guns? Even if you were in favor of, you know, I like to use guns because of sporting purposes, or I want to have a gun in my home to protect my family. Even if those were important things to you, you don't need these kinds of weapons, right? You don't need these assault-type weapons to engage in those practices, right? To the sporting practices or for protection of your family. So it doesn't seem like there's any purpose for these weapons other than to kill large numbers of people quickly, right? Mm-hmm. And why do we need to have that? I mean, it just doesn't seem to be any legitimate justification for having that. And we did ban them at one point, and then that went away, and we have not been able to bring that back. And this feeds into the notion that they're coming to take my guns.
Exactly.
Well, there are some guns that are probably too lethal for people to have, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Yes, and if gun manufacturers want to sell those guns, then I think on the other side there should be some accountability when they are misused. But we know there is no proper use for those in society.
Right.
So maybe that would, you know, teach them a lesson about, you know, the impact of this. It's not just an economic decision for them, but it impacts our society very negatively, and there should be some accountability there.
I think that's a really excellent point that I think isn't talked about enough. That what right do they have to make these guns and put them out there when we know they're endangering people, and we got clear evidence of that. Yeah, I think that would be important, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about the military-industrial complex. I think we can talk about a complex of interest here related to the gun industry. That it's a very profitable industry, right? And the more you can ratchet up people's fear, and the more you can convince people that this is the American way to have these guns, and that you know, again, it's a sign of your manhood to have these kinds of weapons. And again, the National Rifle Association as an organization has become a lobbying front for the gun industry.
Right.
Again, a very profitable industry. And so this is an industry that's profiting from blood and death, you know, in our society. And is there any legal accountability? Well, some families of those who have been killed in mass shootings are suing some of these gun manufacturers, saying it was their advertisements, it was their pushing of these weapons, it was their making available these weapons that led to the mass shooting that killed my family member, right? And so far, you know, we don't have any definitive kind of court rulings along those lines. But there's some litigation that's striving to make those points and to bring some kind of legal accountability to gun manufacturers. And they do have a responsibility, a legal and social responsibility, and they're shirking that responsibility to a large extent.
Yeah, yeah. So there's things we can do, and that should be done to turn the tide on this. Yes. We don't have an awful lot of time left. I wanted to bring up something else. Tuesday was the 20th anniversary of the beginning of the war in Iraq, which I think you were involved in trying to stop that, Ron, a while ago. What was interesting to me was I asked my classes about it. I have 2 undergraduate classes that I'm teaching, and they knew nothing about it at all, which to me is a tragedy, because there's lessons to be learned from that. But they were interested, you know, and about the propaganda that went before it, about the torture and the human rights violations that our people committed, about the way we destroyed that nation. I mean, there's lessons to be learned here. And so I just think it's important to remember that.
Yes, 20 years, it's amazing. I first came on this program, Don, to talk about the impending war. At that time, it was pretty clear that the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, was going to invade Iraq. And I was doing a lot of research on that question, especially in terms of its relationship to international law. So you guys had me come on the program to talk about that, and then we didn't get through it all, so I came back another time, and then eventually I just kept coming back all the time. You couldn't get rid of me.
We were so glad we couldn't.
But yeah, I mean, and again, talking about down the rabbit hole, right? The lack of institutional memory in our society about these things. I mean, what people need to remember is that the George W. Bush administration told blatant lies to convince the American people to do this, right? They said that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. They did not. And we knew they did not, because the UN had inspection teams in there looking for those weapons, and they were making regular reports that they weren't there. They said that Saddam Hussein had connections to the 9/11 terrorist attack. He had none. Absolutely no connection to the terrorist attacks. So there were blatant lies that were told to convince the American people to support this war. The war itself was a blatant violation of international law, violated the UN Charter. And then it also resulted in a host of war crimes, right? Violations of international humanitarian law, the torture and other factors. And you know, the evidence shows that around a million Iraqis died as a result of our invasion, to say nothing of the American soldiers that were killed in the invasion and the chaos that were created throughout the Middle East. If people are interested, I would recommend Andrew Basovich's book on America's War for the Greater Middle East, in which he, you know, again, a conservative historian, but really zeroes in on the major factors that led to that particular invasion and other military efforts in the greater Middle East. So yes, it's really important to remember that. And again, here we are condemning Vladimir Putin for his illegal invasion of Ukraine, and yet we as a nation have carried out the very exact same kind of thing. And I don't remember the condemnation of George W. Bush for carrying out this illegal invasion.
Yeah. Were there any, did the World Court ever indict anybody from the United States for those? I don't know.
No.
They never did.
No, and the problem is, again, here we face sort of the world order conundrum that the United Nations Security Council is the body within the UN that's supposed to enforce international law, right? You can have some cases that go to the World Court, but often those are disputes between two different nations. And you have an international criminal court, but of course the United States is not a signatory to that.
Right.
Which, by the way, the International Criminal Court just basically accused Vladimir Putin of being a war criminal, right? And he is, and he should be held accountable. But then they point out, well, Russia's not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, and neither is the United States.
Of course.
Right? So again, it becomes a toothless international organization that can't really deal with the major geopolitical powers in the world. And so again, and then if we go to the United Nations Security Council and attempt to enforce the law, what happens? The veto. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council have a veto power. So anything of substance gets eliminated. So we have sort of this juridical system, if you will, at the international level. The UN General Assembly, the World Court. So this is kind of a vertical system based on equality before the law, and of course that can do some things, right? That system can do some things, but then intersecting that you have you have the horizontal system, then you have the vertical system of geopolitical powers, right? The major powers that have the veto power at the Security Council. And that runs roughshod over the ability of the rest of the international system to do anything about these problems. So nothing happened to George W. Bush or the United States as a result of their blatant illegal invasion. And of course, not much is going to happen to Vladimir Putin, other than the effort of NATO and other countries to try to impose economic sanctions, right? That becomes then the only available tool that you have to try to deal with this. And so it leaves us in a very difficult situation where we're unable to enforce international law, where we're able to provide any kind of international justice for those who have been violated by the major geopolitical powers.
Yeah. The only thing is he could not travel now to 132 different countries, right?
Right. For those that have signed on to the Rome Statute, as it's called, the International Criminal Court, they have a legal obligation to, if someone has been indicted by the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court and that person shows up in their jurisdiction, then they have a legal obligation to arrest them. So it is going to restrict the ability of Putin to do any kind of traveling to countries. Now, he could come to the United States.
That's right.
No risk of being arrested by the International Criminal Court in the United States, because we don't believe in it either, right?
No.
But again, it just shows that in that geopolitical system, the major powers can basically have immunity and impunity with regard to international law.
Right. So that's gun control on a larger level.
Yes. We can talk about levels of violence at various levels here.
Yeah.
And by the way, John, do we have a few more minutes left here? One other thing that people might pick up on, there was an article in the Guardian newspaper yesterday about a new paper that's going to be published that basically argues that major fossil fuel corporations should be held accountable for homicide, for climate homicide. that they should be prosecuted.
Which you write on.
Well, I wrote my book on carbon criminals, climate crimes, and argued that same point. But this is from a very legalistic perspective, arguing that for all these reasons, this kind of prosecution should proceed.
Wow.
So I'm anxious to get a hold of the paper. I haven't had it. I just found out about it yesterday, but I'm anxious to look at that. So yes, we deal with issues of crime and violence at many different levels, and I guess we can end by saying there's an interconnection here.
Absolutely.
Right? If as a nation we engage in illegal invasions, if we allow our major corporations, a major industry, to engage in practices that kill large numbers of people, how do we not expect that level of violence is also then going to filter down and affect others lower in the society? You know, Martin Luther King, remember, talking to some of the kids in the ghetto, said, well, what about the Vietnam War? And King said, you're right. And I said I could never condemn the violence in the ghetto after that without also condemning my country, which is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world at that time, with the Vietnam War. And so there are these interconnections between these different levels of violence.
Absolutely.
And again, one major issue there is the level of power that people have. And power provides impunity and immunity for those at the top of the system. And those at the bottom of the system who lack that power are the ones that get trucked off to prison, right?
Right.
Well, we're done with our time for today, so I want to thank both Regena Nelson and Don Cooney for a fascinating discussion. I hope that we've illuminated a little bit some of the issues concerning gun violence in American society and what we need to do to deal with it, and connected it to some larger issues of nation-state violence as well. So we hope that you will come back again and visit us here on the set of Critical Issues, Alternative Views.